one of the best books that have ever been written on the subject was written by a man by the name of Neely Fuller. His book is basically a handbook for people who are the victims of white supremacy. In a nutshell, I guess white supremacy is a concept that may have had its origins around the time of at the onset of the slave trade. You know, you have Europeans, coming down from Europe on these ships, and it marks the beginning of what they call in history the age of exploration. But I think if you were asked to ask the darker races on the planet what it really was, they call it the age of exploitation. Essentially, the tribes, the warring tribes of Europe, were unified under the concept of Christianity. They still had their issues in capitalism. And they set their sights on our historical homeland as African people, which is Africa. Now, just to give you an idea of what the setting was at that time, when you come down into Africa, what the Europeans found was a place where Africans were not united necessarily on this concept that we call in the West blackness or being, African. The African identity was really rooted in tribalism. In other words, or the term that they commonly refer to as tribalism, but we call it gigantic extended families. The Africans' concept of unity was based on I'm a Wolof, I'm a Mandinga, I'm a Hausa, I'm a Yoruba, I'm a Fulani, I'm a Maasai, I'm an Asante. And that's how they saw themselves. So they never really united with this concept of we should be together because we're all black. In fact, we didn't understand blackness until we all winded up on those slave ships in the West when we realized that our oppression was primarily based on the fact that, it was based on the color of our skin. And, by a long shot, the Europeans were definitely not united, but they were united in three important ways. They were united on the idea that every white person, regardless of what country they came from in Europe, was superior to any African, regardless of what his tribal affiliation was. In addition to that, they were united under the concept of Christianity, and they were also united in the idea of capitalism. We're going to, exploit these people out of their minds. Now, the very interesting idea about white supremacy, we know that the whole slave trade was blessed by the Pope, and he set up lines of demarcation for Spain and Portugal, who were the primary powerhouses in the slave trade. In fact, the Portuguese took so many slaves that we have 80 million Africans in Brazil. Brazil is probably the most populous African nation, is the most populous African nation outside of Nigeria, which has about 100 million Africans. In Brazil, there's no country in Africa with as many slaves or many African people as Brazil. Now, back on the subject of the origins of white supremacy, they get there and I imagine they must have said to themselves, how are we going to conquer this vast continent, with all these African people? We're just a handful of Europeans. And so they said, what we must do is exploit the fundamental weakness of the Africans. When you look at Africa, Africa is the most ethnically diverse place on the planet, with more than 250 tribes being victimized by the slave trade. So when you think about that, that is incredible. I mean, if you consider the most populous nation on the planet, China, the two dominant languages for 2 billion people are Cantonese and Mandarin. Just two languages for all of those people. But in Africa, there are over 600 different languages and tribal dialects spoken in what they call sub-Sahara or Black Africa, which made it possible for them to take this large population of Africans and be able to subdue so many of us in the slave trade. I mean, if you think about it, you know from history that the slave ships never carried a particular African tribe. They always had little pieces of different tribes so that the people could not communicate and make rebellion. So when we look at the slave trade, we have to be aware of the fact that we didn't understand this whole concept of blackness until we were actually the victims of the slave trade, and that the African never really had an understanding of slavery comparable to what took place in the West. Because you always hear these people when they talk about African history, they always talk about the Africans' role in slavery, and they always say things like, oh, slavery has always existed in the world, and the Africans themselves had slaves. But I think that we would do ourselves a great service in the West to look at slavery for what it really was. It wasn't really slavery. It was the dehumanization of a group of people based on race. And it's a very, very different concept, because I'm sure anybody would agree there never was an African slave who was enslaved based on his skin color, because everybody in Africa, was African. In fact, one of the best books people can read on this subject is a book by Equiano, who was a slave who wrote a narrative of his life, where he talked about his enslavement in West Africa compared to his experience when he was kidnapped and brought into American slavery. And just to summarize, he basically says there's absolutely no comparison in terms of what a human being actually experienced. So I think that we would be better to look at our enslavement in the West as, you know, peculiar, as they used to call it, the peculiar institution, and we should also be looking at it and talking about it in terms of the dehumanization, which never went, you know, was unprecedented in history. White supremacy as an idea, to me, is extremely simple to understand when you understand that the world is a battle in the minds of Europeans for resources. And the best way to dominate non-Europeans is to create a system of racial hierarchy based on white people being superior to other people. Now, this is very critical because I've always often said to a lot of people that part of the problem with Europeans is that when you get into idolatry and the idea that God is somehow white, it does elevate your concept of yourself. Because if you look at the Michelangelo image of Jesus Christ, and you see and you're born and raised in a culture where you're always seeing God in terms of whiteness, it's very easy not to respect the rights of other people and to feel that you have a manifest destiny, you know, all these little code words that they use to justify white supremacy. It's very easy to take on that attitude. I mean, if we consider the fact that the true biblical translation of the first commandment prior to, I guess, the King James Version and other versions, you know, say things like the first commandment says, not what most people think it says. They say, oh, I'm the Lord your God, don't have any other gods before me. That sounds like the first commandment. But in fact, it says, I'm the Lord your God, don't make any graven images of divine. There's a big difference. Because here you have in the biblical story Moses coming down from the mountain and destroying the idol, because the physicalization of the Creator is a serious crime. It's a crime that is one of the reasons why Abraham, the patriarch of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, is supposed to reportedly have destroyed the idols of his father, and it was thrown into the furnace for doing this. So this whole idea of physicalizing God is very, very powerful. We know that symbolism and we know that imagery is very, very powerful in terms of controlling people. And part of the reasons why the African world has suffered under the brutality of global white supremacy for the last 500 years is because all over the globe, wherever you find us immersed in not only the practice of Christianity, something that we learned from you know, Europeans, but also the imagery. So I'm not here to say what religious path a person should choose or to attack one religion as over another. I'm just simply saying that we should also be very, very aware that that imagery is part and parcel as to why we have so many problems asserting ourselves, because deep down inside, if the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost is some white man in the sky, you know, because I'm telling you, you go to many of our elders' homes, you see these huge images of Europeans. And ironically, you cannot really go against somebody that you see as your God figure, you know. So I often imagine that part of the problem with us even reacting to the brutality that we've experienced in the terrorism is so interesting that in this era we talk so much about terrorism. But we have been globally terrorized as a people. I mean, whether you want to talk about the slave trade or Black Wall Street or, you know, 41 shots on one guy, you know, this is terrorism and the destruction of our family life, the flooding of the Black community with drugs. So we're looking at a real systematic attempt to terrorize us and to teach us, you know, what one great psychologist said, B.F. Skinner said, that if you show me, if I can control the consequences, I can control a person's behavior. And if you look at what's happening to us, you know, what has happened to us as African people in this country, you will find that at certain points in our history, consequences were shown to us in order to control our behavior. For example, if you look at the end of slavery, you hear people talk about slavery ending in 1865. And I always beg to differ. If we wrote our own history books as we should be writing, I would say that slavery ended in the 1960s. Now, why am I saying that? Because when the Africans tried to make that migration to leave the plantations following slavery, you know, first we had the promise that was unfulfilled, 40 acres and a mule. You got to remember, at the time of slavery, land really had no value unless you had somebody to work it.